A desperate father fighting for his family, a village overrun by monsters born from myth, and a horrifying secret that will tear them all apart. When Resident Evil Village was released on May 7th, 2021, it looked to carry on the momentum created by Resident Evil 7, continuing the story of Ethan Winters and his family, but pushing it into a new, more mainstream-friendly direction, and leaving behind the small, horrifying approach of its predecessor. A good idea in theory, but a strange one in execution. From werewolves to vampires to witches, creepy dolls, and a whole lot of mold, Resident Evil 8 Village feels like the classic Universal monsters suddenly taking over a franchise best known for zombies, bioweapons, and high-tech conspiracies. But can a 30-year-old franchise with dozens of games ever really get away from its roots? As the 8th entry in the mainline Resident Evil games, Village is a strange mishmash of brand new ideas, a still fresh approach to gameplay, and a reversion to the action and over-the-top tropes that the series had only just gotten away from. And now, only 5 years later and with multiple remakes released and the upcoming RE9 on the way, Village feels like a story and style that Resident Evil has quickly left behind. But why? This is the story of Resident Evil Village, a folk horror adventure, and the end of Ethan Winters. Thank God.
Stars? I'll give you stars!
The story of Resident Evil Village may continue on the journey of Ethan Winters from the open ending of Resident Evil 7, but development on the game actually began all the way back on August 8th, 2016, half a year before 7 even came out. And the result is a game that blended several different aspects of the franchise as developers continued to figure out what players actually really responded to with their newest iteration of RE. With the team deep into production on 7 and using its RE engine to push the series into a new direction, it was a no-brainer that 8 would use the same first-person approach. And once 7 was a hit, the team decided to carry on Ethan Winters' story, eventually settling on a European village setting to pay homage to Resident Evil 4, just with a fresh take. If Resident Evil 7 was like a reboot that inherited the DNA of the original Resident Evil, then you could say that this time we're doing the same for Resident Evil 4, said producer Tsuyoshi Kanda. We've designed the game and its structure with Resident Evil 4's essence in mind, so I think you'll be able to find a lot of elements that remind you of that game. And that's absolutely true, for better and worse. Resident Evil 8 picks up 3 years after the end of RE7, with Ethan and Mia now living in Eastern Europe after being relocated by Chris Redfield to start a new life. Not only that, but they have a newborn daughter, Rosemary. And while things mostly seem okay, their peaceful life is violently interrupted when Chris and his squad blast into their home and brutally gun down Mia, taking Ethan and Rose into custody, only for their transport to be attacked and crash. In the aftermath, Rose is missing and Ethan's search for his daughter leads him to a village cut off from the rest of the world and under siege by werewolf-like creatures. Soon, Ethan's battle for survival brings him face to face with the village priestess Mother Miranda and her 4 lords, who rule the area and have each been given strange powers from the Megamycete, a massive collective consciousness super fungus that was also the cause of the Baker infection from Evelyn in Resident Evil 7. Eventually, we come to find that baby Rose has special powers too, but has been vivisected into 4 separate containers. But don't worry, she'll be fine. With Ethan on a journey to bring her back to life and stop a rampaging host of monsters that reflect mythical fears. If the larger purpose of Resident Evil Village is, whether intentionally or not, to revert the franchise back to what it was like during the heyday of 4 and 5, then there is one element of this game that truly does set it apart from the rest of the series, and that's its use of folk horror and classic monster archetypes. The marketing for RE8 and a large portion of the game heavily relies on placing the player in a much older setting and playing around with a lot of creatures that are derived from ancient myths and classic horror. In a lot of ways, it's the Resident Evil game that shares the most DNA with the universal classic monsters. And while I like a lot of that, I think some of its execution, especially in later parts of the game, is lacking in a few areas. At the start, Village opens with Mia reading a fairy tale titled Village of Shadows to Rose about a little girl traveling through a dark forest and encountering different creatures that foreshadow the game's bosses until her father and mother come to save her. It's a really moody, beautifully designed opening that evokes the works of Henry Selick and really amps up the fairy tale-like aspects of the story to come. I just wish the rest of the game stuck to this darkly whimsical approach. And as Ethan begins to open up more and more of the village, its monsters and locations are divided up into specific sections, each with their own creatures, themes, and gameplay styles. Lady Dimitrescu and her so-called daughters are essentially vampires who live in an ancient castle. They want to drink your shitty blood and can grow knife fingers and shift into hordes of bugs. Add in Lady D turning into what is essentially a busted dragon, and the classic horror is very much here, complete with dungeons, blood-filled cellars, and puzzle solving. Village also uses the pursuer system here as Lady Dimitrescu constantly chases you for some sections. Of course, given how the general audience responded to the early previews of the game, I bet a bunch of you were happy to be caught by the big lady. Donna Beneviento would love Reddit if they had internet access in the village, staying in her creepy but quite charming house, and using her powers to make victims hallucinate and give life to her dolls. She's the ultimate indoor kid, and Ethan is very quickly stripped of his weapons for this section, with the majority of it being a creepy mannequin puzzle, followed by what is essentially the scariest portion of this game, the giant laughing fetus monster. Really puts life into perspective when you say it out loud like that. And finally, a game of hide and seek as we try to find and kill miniature asshole doll Angie. And on first playthrough, I absolutely loved this section. On repeats, kinda boring. Salvatore Moreau is a fuck-ass merman whose hunchback body is filled with fish guts. His dam and shack is giving late semester boys' college dorm room, complete with musky scent. And while he's pretty pathetic, we have some cat and mouse as we skip across the water, trying to not get eaten on pontoons. I like the look of his section, but it's maybe the most forgettable. Heisenberg is, well, Magneto, I guess? Honestly, his factory level, filled with zombies he is Tetsuo the Iron Man, it's a verb now, is unfortunately the weakest of the four, made worse by it being the last and longest. Most of his minions have a specific weak point you need to repeatedly shoot, with the propeller-headed Sturm being nearly invulnerable, and culminating in Heisenberg transforming himself into a giant mass of metal and goo for a Transformers Revenge of the Fallen fight. And Mother Miranda herself is a lot like a classic witch, shape-shifting from powerful goddess to old crone to massive monster at a whim, and drawing her power directly from the Megamycete. Like every Resident Evil game, Village is playing with the dynamic of monsters that seem like supernatural boogeymen, who are eventually revealed to be man-made bioweapons. And Mother Miranda is the key to all that. Eventually shown to be a woman who lost her daughter Eve a century ago to the Spanish flu and was empowered by the Megamycete. In the time since, she's attempted to bring her back, resulting in Evelyn from 7 and now wanting to put her daughter's spirit into baby Rose. All these other creatures were just failed attempts at creating the perfect host for Eva, and now they hate her for it. Having each of these houses placed in their own geographic location and really locking you into their story until completely finished means that Village feels a lot like an anthology, with multiple short stories connected through the overarching story of Ethan Winters and Mother Miranda. However, like almost every anthology film or book, it means that RE8 is very uneven. I guess what I'm saying is that I like Village more for its story and style instead of its actual gameplay experience, which is a shame because great Resident Evil games are loved by fans because of their ability to be played over and over again. Of course, with very different villains and playstyles, everyone will have their own favorite house. Personally, House Dimitrescu is my favorite because it has great villains. Lady D was instantly made into an icon of the franchise for many reasons. The gameplay here is probably the most satisfying, and it does the best job at balancing a classic monster aesthetic with modern RE action. And when compared to the other houses, it also really highlighted the game's greatest weakness. Well, second greatest behind Ethan being a dumbass. Poor replay value. So the first time I played RE8, I finished it in about 10 hours. I'm not a completionist, but I like to experience as much of a game as I can if I really like it, without that getting in the way of story and the overall gameplay flow. And I thought that was a solid way to experience it as I sort of crept through the game at a decent clip. The second time I played it, I finished it in about 6.5 hours, which is a huge chunk of time taken out, and I really wasn't trying to speedrun it. The reason is because I realized that no matter what the game threw at me, all I really had to do was charge straight forward ahead to continue to succeed in the game. See, Village has a major problem that I think a lot of modern games are suffering from. It's too cinematic. Obviously, the blend between a strong story with cutscenes and satisfying gameplay is the goal of a lot of AAA games these days, but on replaying, what I realized is that a ton of RE8 is made up of cinematic gameplay that really only has one small path forward for players to take. All those explosions, roaring lichens, and locked doors are window dressing on what can often feel like an amusement park ride. Of course, I love amusement park rides, but they're not video games for a reason. On replay, I realized that even when an area was laid out like a puzzle, there was only ever one route to succeed, and then I could basically sprint through each area to hit the locked door, get the key, backtrack, and move forward, without ever really having to think about it. The same goes for boss encounters. As long as you're not playing on the hardest difficulty, Village of Shadows, a little aggression goes a long way. And when you can just pump a monster full of bullets to put them down, all those werewolves, vampires, super ghouls, and goblins don't feel all that scary anymore. Worst of all is that there's really not all that much to these gameplay loops. Push forward, unlock a door, run into a group of monsters, then unload and basically back up a little to maintain distance. Repeat. This isn't all that different from RE7's approach, but whereas that game is so creepy, slow, focused on survival, and genuinely scary, 8 is all about fast-paced action, which jams in so many of these loops that they become obvious. If I can single-handedly take out an entire castle full of werewolves, where's the horror? Resident Evil has always been about self-empowerment and discovery that allows characters and the player to conquer their fears, and that's the case here too. But there's also something about folk horror that simply doesn't mix all that well with Resident Evil's modernist, science-based approach to monsters. Folk horror can be translated in a lot of different ways, but no matter the style or medium, these are stories that are mostly about outsiders that wander into a cut-off civilization that has its own strange customs, dangers, religions, and practices that may or may not be supernaturally empowered. Now, someday I'll make a video dedicated to folk horror, but for now, just think of movies like The Wicker Man, Midsommar, or The Ritual. And Village leans heavily on folk horror in its early hours. I especially love the section with Elena and her family's house that all goes wrong. It's super effective, and I just wish it was a thread that continued through the game. Instead, Village quickly transitions to more mythological monsters. Classic myths and monsters were born out of humanity's inability to explain nature and their own fears manifesting creatures out of the dark. Suddenly, the woods at night were filled with man-eating beasts, the seas home to aquatic terror, the darkness a portal to another realm. None of these related to one another, and each the byproduct of a distinct region and culture. Here, they're all the product of Mother Miranda sampling the giant mold of the Megamycete and creating Kadu parasites to implant in villagers. Most die, some turn into the rampaging lichens, and just a few become unique monsters that reflect ancient myths. It's a pretty simple origin for some of the most iconic creatures in the history of storytelling. That means that these monsters also don't have their classic weaknesses. No need for a silver bullet or a wooden stake or a whole bunch of fire to put these creatures down. Instead, you just need to shoot them in the head. And when a monster can be killed by anything, well, they're not all that scary. Classic monsters and heavy artillery simply do not go hand in hand. Just ask the Dark Universe. One of my biggest critiques about RE8 is that while the game is a lot more action-focused, its actual gameplay system is basically directly ported over from 7, and 7 is a lot more survival horror-focused. Those enemies soak up your attacks and make it a lot scarier because it makes you feel weak. Here in 8, besides the opening Lycan attack, you feel pretty powerful pretty quickly, upgrading your weapons and blasting through your enemies by about the midway point. Except the game isn't really designed to make you feel that heavy combat. Guns have barely any kickback, enemies don't recoil for most hits, and there's a smoothness to the game that makes you kind of feel like you're gliding through instead of being in a real physical combat situation. That's a tricky experience for any game to achieve, after all it's one big simulation, but when a game gets it right, it feels so good. This is clearly a balance that the Village team struggled with, as more combat and power means less scares, with game director Morimasa Sato saying, "That is indeed something we need to be very careful with. If you increase the action, it quickly turns into a game that allows you to kill enemy after enemy. That is not what I want. It's important that the player constantly feels afraid of the enemies, and the experience should be all about overcoming that fear." The thing is, you kinda overcome that fear for good a couple hours into the game, and you never fully restore that feeling. And spoilers obviously, but I can't help but roll my eyes at the late game reveal that Mother Miranda and the Mega Mice seat was the original inspiration for Oswald Spencer and his creation of Umbrella. With the two meeting and researching the mold together decades ago, and Spencer taking a liking to a random Umbrella logo pulled from the four lords of the area. That's weak. I feel as if this was Capcom's attempt to make up for Resident Evil 4 having no actual connection to the larger, overarching Resident Evil story. Here is your most popular game that, besides featuring a few characters, is completely siloed in its own story and location and ideas, with no connection to Umbrella, who by this point was seemingly gone for good. And in the decades since, no matter what, Umbrella has returned in different ways, and that larger story has continued, making Resident Evil 4 feel like a bit of the odd duck in the larger narrative, yet it's still the most beloved and, in my opinion, the best game in the franchise. RE8 functions a lot like 4, but it pushes this last-second connection to Umbrella and the larger story for no real reason. Yeah, I don't really like that. Honestly, we should have been done with Umbrella when the opening credits of RE4 said they died on the way back to their home planet off-screen. And given that Ethan has nothing to do with Umbrella, it's purely for player recognition. One of the other big hooks of Village is the question of whether Chris Redfield has fully gone to the dark side. 7's ending, with the reveal of Chris Redfield, thank God they changed his appearance for 8, and Blue Umbrella, left players with a cliffhanger regarding what had happened to Chris in the time since we last saw him. Of course, having Chris and his squad assault your home and kill your wife in cold blood immediately makes you see Chris as a villain here. And while the long, dark trench coat and the way he's framed for most of the game doesn't help, the biggest reason for seeing him as a villain is that the game's writers make sure that he never, ever even tries to explain himself until late in the game for the sake of a twist. See, that wasn't really Mia. It was Mother Miranda shapeshifting to look like her and abduct Rose, with the real Mia once again kidnapped for months. Poor lady has spent most of her adult life in creepy basement prisons, and the assault a surprise attack to take her out. Of course, Chris is too busy to explain all this, choosing instead to lambast Ethan for getting upset at his supposed wife's murder. Oh, boo-hoo, Ethan. Twists for twist's sake, reveals for reveal's sake. It's not great writing, and like a lot of the game, it's worse on replay when you already know where it's all going and have no patience for the writing. And that leads us to Village's final twist and how we wrap up Ethan's story. I feel as though it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg situation, but with Ethan surviving and healing from such extreme injuries in 7 with little hesitation, the only way to explain it is to show that he's been infected by the mold since early on in 7, with this revelation coming from Miranda ripping his heart out and his body eventually healing. Prior to the reveal, moments like Lady D cutting his hand off and him reattaching it, including the sleeve, are so cartoonish they can only make you laugh. Afterward, it's a fun little reveal, ultimately turning Ethan into a tragic figure who must destroy himself to end the Mega Mice seat. And with Village turning Ethan into a fully fleshed out character who has motivations, a story arc, a family, and who just won't shut up, he's no longer a player surrogate, even if we still can't see his face.
Teach her to be strong. God damn. Goodbye, Rosemary.
All of this would be a lot more tragic if Capcom's commitment to not showing his face didn't result in him eating shit like a dog in the Yamcha pose, and the game just kinda going, oh well, here's Chris, go kick some ass. In the end, a revived Ethan destroys Miranda, obliterates the Megamycete, and sends Chris, Rose, and Mia off in a tragic farewell. The threat of the village now over for good. Of course, that wouldn't be the end of the story. In what is maybe the most essential DLC in Resident Evil history, Capcom would go on to release Shadows of Rose, which continues Village's epilogue as Rosemary, now 16 years old, seeks to rid herself of her powers by traveling into a remnant of the Megamycete and connecting with its collective consciousness. Really, the biggest difference in Shadows of Rose is that it plays as much more of a classic survival horror, now in third person and having Rose revisit locations like the castle and House Beneviento. Here, ammo is actually scarce, enemies are in close cramped quarters, and running is usually your best option. And that's a nice change after the combat-heavy village. Eventually, we find that remnants of the consciousness of everyone who died connected to the Megamycete still exist within the mold, including Evelyn and Miranda, who attempt to possess her as she's helped by a mysterious friend. Of course, you can guess who it is. It's Ethan, who by the end is able to have an emotional connection with his grown-up daughter, helping her to embrace her power and defeat Miranda for good. And while it leaves Rose's future open-ended, I see Shadows of Rose as really closing the door on the Winters story. Not just because it takes place so much further into the future than where the series currently is, but because it gives Rose and Ethan a positive, somewhat happy ending after 2 games full of suffering and loss. Oh, and I guess Mia is back locked in a dungeon somewhere again. And I think that's a nice place to leave a story that is somewhat of a detour to the larger Resident Evil narrative, giving our characters a much stronger, more effective emotional conclusion that I think the end of Village doesn't quite reach. But seriously, the commitment to the bit of not showing Ethan's face is a bad idea. You gave him a personality and a voice, just show us his mug. So with Village carrying on the approach of 7 while still being part of the larger Residentaissance along with the remakes of 2 and 3 that were released in the years before, how did the game perform? Well, unsurprisingly, it sold a lot. After its release on May 7th, 2021, RE8 sold 3 million copies in its first 4 days, putting it on par with the performance of the RE2 remake, and going on to sell a total of more than 13 million copies in the time since. That's a little less than the 16 million sold by both 6 and 7, but with fewer years on the market, and similar to the remakes of 2, 3, and 4. Not too surprising, at this point, the Resident Evil franchise is such a juggernaut that any mainline title is going to sell really well. Still, I can't help but wonder what the lasting legacy of Resident Evil 8 will be in the long run. I think that 7 will always have a special place in the hearts of fans because of how unique, scary, and revitalizing it is. It's a game that breaks out of Resident Evil and has its own legacy, but 8 seems like it was designed to keep that feeling going while also trying to recapture the feeling of Resident Evil 4. It's all there. Solo adventure in Europe, angry infected villagers, Victorian-era aesthetics, a more classic style of monsters but with a parasite empowering them, and a heavy emphasis on combat to fight your way through hordes of smart enemies. The thing is, just 2 years later, Capcom released the Resident Evil 4 remake to massive acclaim, essentially refining and updating everything amazing about their greatest game and giving fans the exact thrills and sense of adventure that 8 was trying to copy. So in essence, Capcom replaced their replacement with an upgrade of what everyone wanted in the first place. Plus, no Ethan. Always positive. In the end, Resident Evil 8 Village has one of the strangest combinations of gameplay and story in the entire franchise. The first-person, in-your-face horror of 7, the disconnected European setting of 4, the constant combat of 5. But a family-focused story and blend of mythic monsters you simply don't think of as part of this franchise. The result is a game that will always stand out in the larger context of Resident Evil, even if it may illustrate the limitations of this approach to survival horror. And with Resident Evil 9 going back to Raccoon City, Leon Kennedy, and zombies, another franchise reset may be upon us. But whenever we're ready, that dark village of shadows with a century of secrets will be waiting for our return. Thanks for watching today's video, and it's definitely time to talk about Resident Evil again. With Resident Evil 9 just a few weeks away from this video's release, I thought that now would be a great time to talk about Resident Evil 8. If you're not familiar with the channel, I have been talking about Resident Evil for quite a while, and up to this point I have made videos on 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, and all their remakes, as well as different side stories and lore and the movies. So obviously, I love Resident Evil. I figured I would get around to talking about 8 at some point, and when 9's release was solidified, I knew when that time would be. Unfortunately, my replay of Resident Evil 8 kinda shone a harsh light on the game for me. I enjoyed it on the first go-through, and it's by no means a bad game, but replays really do highlight its limitations and weaknesses. It's fun, but not fun for a lot of replays. In the end, it's just a strange combination of a lot of different choices that I don't think add up quite as well as the developers were hoping they would. And with 9 really breaking hard away from 8, I think Capcom realized that too. In the end, when people are still most excited about remakes of older games instead of your newer ones, you're probably going to want to make your next new one feel a little bit more like those remakes. I'm excited about 9, and I'm sure I'll talk about it a little bit after it comes out. Hopefully it's great, I'm really excited. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Resident Evil 8, where you would rank Village in the larger scheme of mainline Resident Evil games, and what you're hoping for from RE9. And as always, a huge thanks to my members and patrons for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every review, and monthly exclusive reviews voted on by my members and patrons. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and playing one of your favorite Resident Evil games.